Karla and I met simultaneously. The universe has brought us together, but we share something very near and dear to our hearts, and that is the story of caregiving. And so Karla is an advocate and someone who has been working to represent those specifically within the Alzheimer's unit area of life, right? And then through Alzheimer's, you've also, because of the dedication that your dad, who had Alzheimer's, had to refugees, that has been a huge passion project of yours as well. And some of you might recognize Karla because she's also a local TV personality and anchor on KARE 11. Now, I say all of the other things first because not that I lessen your job at KARE, but I know your heart and some of the things that people don't necessarily get to see on a regular basis. And you're just such an amazing human, not to mention you're a mom and a wife and a daughter and a sister and so many titles. And so that's why I wanted you here today to share your caregiving story with us. So maybe you can just start with that part of things.
Yeah, well, thank you. It is such an honor to be here, and I so appreciate it. As many of you know, if you are tuning in to Shannon at all or a client of hers, she's a force of nature. So it's a true pleasure to join her and to connect with her. And I should even mention that she actually introduced herself to me when I was emceeing the Alzheimer's Walk, which is the largest walk in the country in Minneapolis. And that's always a point of pride. But after I had given this speech there, she introduced herself to me. Little did we know that we would later be in the same mastermind group. So it is a true pleasure and honor to join you today as well.
And how the universe works. It's funny how the universe works.
It's amazing. I love how the universe works as well. I do wish that we shared a different connection and that our paths crossed and intersected for different reasons, perhaps. And so as Shannon mentioned, I have my dad right here. This is just, I won't show a ton of pictures, but this is my wedding picture of my dad and me walking down the aisle. And it's a little hard to see, a little blurry over the old Zoom, but you get the idea that it's just a really natural expression of joy. And so my dad, throughout my life, was just this larger-than-life role model. And he was a very classic Minnesota dad. He loved to fish. He loved his family. He served his community. He worked for 3M. Can't get more Minnesota than that. And And he just had this real connection to the community. He had a twin brother and a family of Swedes. I mean, his great-grandparents, actually his grandparents, my great-grandparents, had immigrated from Sweden. So he had that connection there. So a really Swedish family. But at the same time, he was from a broken family as a child. And so before really the community, society could support that dynamic. And so he had a tough childhood. But throughout all of that, and maybe because of all of that, he was able to create this own internal strength and really appreciate what was given to him and how to give to others, and the strength and support that you can find in really special relationships. For him, initially, it was his twin brother, my Uncle Bill, and then, of course, later in life, he met my mom, Marlissa Marie of Minneapolis. So they had 3 strong girls. I was the youngest of them, and he just was that amazing person. Pretty traditional in that my mom was home with us, and he worked really long hours, and because he was also serving the community, he'd be at meetings until really late, but he'd go from, I've written before, he'd go from his meetings to my meets, and he would show up, and he just would offer that insight and that advice, and again, that example of how to live life. And we talked a little bit about refugees and in the 1970s and in the 1980s, when the Hmong were leaving Laos in the wake of all of the chaos in that region of the country, and obviously after the Vietnam War and so forth, and coming to Minnesota, my dad served as a really important liaison from our church and really from the overall community to our newest neighbors, so that my closest friends growing up were Hmong, and it was a beautiful relationship. And
I don't think I've ever shared this with you, Karla. My best friend growing up is Hmong, and her and I did a school project junior year of high school on the Hmong migration to Minnesota. So like, again, just like crazy connections that we have.
Crazy connection. That's fabulous. And I love that. And I love too, when everyone recognizes it's just where in the timeline did you come, right? So for my dad, he always recognized it was his grandparents who boarded a boat coming to America for a better life. And in our Hmong friend situation, it was just their recent reality, given the circumstances of their former country and what they hoped for a new life in their current country. So again, all of these were these values that my dad just, demonstrated and lived every day. And he was a man of faith and just of good values. And so I one of my favorite dad stories, and I just want to share this very briefly because I just think it speaks so much to how he was as a father. But I was in graduate school in New York City and was engaged to be married, and the wedding was called off. And so here I am at the end of a really rigorous, graduate degree program, and heartbroken, and my heart rug thrown out from under me. And I didn't, my dad literally bought a red-eye ticket from Minneapolis to Philadelphia, waited in a train station until dawn, took the first train up to New York, hailed a cab, went up to my apartment in Upper New York City, Upper East West Side, and then helped me load my apartment into the moving truck, and then drove with me all day, and just literally was there, and just in those moments was telling me, you're not alone. I'm still here. I love you. And it wasn't like we had that really sit down, profound conversation on that day, but he told me that in his actions. And that's just really a good example of the kind of dad he was. He was very much there. So I survived that little breakup and went on to continue my journalism career, and eventually got back to Minnesota and, got married, started having kids. But here's where it all kind of started happening, is that as I became a mother, and actually was pregnant, about 7 months pregnant with my first, that we started realizing that dad was confused, struggling to find the right words, and that sort of thing. And he had a hospital visit, and he was honestly fairly delusional. And there's some studies that have literally documented that narcotics can kind of give you a preview of what's to come. It exacerbates the symptoms, if you will. So during that, we had an idea of what might be down the road for us. And Alzheimer's runs very heavily in my dad's family. But he kind of recovered from that stage and from that specific incident, but then it was a slow decline. And so after my second daughter was born, my dad was still able to hold his grandchildren, and he was still able to be pop for a little bit, but increasingly it was very difficult for him to carry a conversation and to be left alone. And so it's then that we really realized this is it. And it was a couple of full years after we noticed the symptoms that we got the official diagnosis, even though we were aware and we were attuned to what was happening. It's that denial that can often happen, particularly maybe with a proud Swede or a proud Minnesota man, who doesn't want to acknowledge the decline. And then I'll always remember the conversation.
How old was your dad when you started to see signs of?
70 years old, which to me still seems tragically young. There's, unfortunately, with the Alzheimer's disease, there's early onset, which is utterly heartbreaking because it's the same disease that just happened.
That was my dad.
Yeah, and that to me is just awful. And people in their 40s and their 50s, when they have even children in their own home still, let alone, you might even also have, grandkids coming, but you're too at your prime. This disease is horrific at any stage. That early onset is especially awful. So yeah, that's when we started.
Yeah, my dad was, he almost self-diagnosed himself, actually.
He really, and he was upfront and transparent about
he
it.
was. I say he's a little bit of a different, because that doesn't always happen in my line of work. I see that, a lot more stories like your dad's, where there's a little bit more of that Swede stubborn, especially in Minnesota, that, you don't want to. And I will say this, not to categorize men, but, when that happens with a man, like, I don't want to give up my freedom. Right. And because the disease is, it's debilitating from an aspect of, like, we just transitioned my dad to not being able to use zippers on pants, and he still, he wants to tie his own shoes, but he doesn't tie them properly. And so for somebody that's, my dad's supposed to turn 70 this year. And he was officially diagnosed at 60, right before he turned 65. So technically the doctors called it early onset because they believe that he had it prior to that.
Sure.
I mean, you show your wedding picture of you and your dad, and that is the last really moment I remember with my dad being kind of the same person. And now it's not, I don't even, he's in there somewhere, and I see glimpses of him every once in a while, but it's so hard to say, what do we call it? The long goodbye, right?
We do. Yeah. The long goodbye, although, and Shannon, you'll have to let me know if you agree with this, but I also often call it so many goodbyes because I feel like we're saying goodbye individually to, okay, this is the last time my dad recognized me. I have to say goodbye to him, realizing I'm his daughter. This is the last time he can speak. This is the last time he can walk. I feel like it's a series of goodbyes, such that you expect maybe that the final goodbye will be easier because you've experienced so many goodbyes up until that. But actually, I think that you're somewhat depleted by that point. But I'm just to emphasize again, I'm so sorry that your dad is in the course of this too, and that he's on that journey. My heart breaks, and especially when it starts earlier. It doesn't matter when it starts, but it's just even worse when it starts earlier.
It is. And I went through a lot of different emotions. This has been 5-6 years that we've been on this journey with my dad already. And so, the first couple of years were actually still pretty good. And my dad and I are big jokesters. We constantly joke and make fun of each other, and we still do, even now. I can't do it as much, but, I still, couple zingers, you and I have talked about that, like I still maintain some regularities, but without poking too much fun at him. Cause there's, now I can't do that as much. Right. His emotional aspect of things has changed. And so now I have to figure out a new way to have a relationship with my dad too, because for 30-ish plus years, it was always, crack a few jokes here and there. And, through my breakups, I've countless of them as well, that my dad, showed up at my dorm room or, was just there without saying everything. He showed up and was kind of my dad was never the Papa Bear with the shotgun. He's not a Minnesota guy. He's an artist, hippie.
Yeah.
So he's probably let's all love each other, but also keep your hands away from my daughter. He was a little bit of that. So I think one of the pieces in talking about this is how, as a caregiver, and we can't anticipate falling into that. I didn't anticipate being pregnant with my second child as well and walking into this. You didn't anticipate, no matter how much it runs rampant in your family history, you never really plan to have that experience happen to you. But how do you care for yourself while you're also caring for somebody else?
I think that's the challenge, right? And I think it's important to recognize practically what you need to do, and then emotionally what you need to be aware of. And practically, there's a lot, right? There's navigating the disease itself and loving and caring for your loved one and respecting him and providing the kind of care that he or she deserves. And to the extent that you can afford it too, because that's a huge caveat, right? But so trying to figure out the kind of care that you can provide. Is it a family member who has the ability within their schedule and in their lifestyle and has the strength and the patience and the skills to be present and to provide that kind of constant care? Or is it someone who you bring in? And then it's, trying to cycle through and figure out who is a qualified caregiver and that sort of thing. And that's a huge challenge. And there's a whole, several ideals and several characteristics you want to look out for, as well as red flags to be aware of, right? So it's you have the checklist. caregivers, make sure the loved one is cared, and then always recognizing, sadly, the disease will get worse. So preparing for those next steps. Okay, so when he declines to this point, where should he go when he requires long-term care center care? And, so checking out those places in advance so that you're not in that emergency mode and figuring that out. How financially am I going to afford this? Do they have the finances that mom and dad or however the family organization is? Or are we exploring Medicare and what that will cover and what facilities specifically will accept Medicare and Medicaid payments? So researching that all ahead of time. But throughout all of that, when you're caregiving, it's also trying to carve out the time to just, be able to be with the person first and foremost, just connect with this person who is, while a different person, still there with you.
Mm-hmm.
He or she is still there physically, and you can still hold his hand and you can still look in his eyes, and he may not have the full understanding of your history or even your relationship for that matter, but you do, and this man, and all that he means, and just having that connection still matters so much. So for your own heart, for his, but also even especially for your own, taking that time and carving it out to just be present and be connected. And then apart from all of that, also allowing yourself separate from your loved one, separate from all the practical decisions, giving yourself the time and the space to, first of all, maybe grieve a little bit because you're constantly grieving. So give yourself that grace to grieve. And then from there, also be able to preserve your own identity, because it's so consuming. This disease is so overwhelming and it can just color every aspect of your life. But you need to still, especially if you have multiple titles, as we talked about, especially if you're mom, especially if you're working in, you need to still be able to bring the joy to your kids. They can't see only the grieving mama. You need to be able to bring the joy. And so you need to be able to allow yourself that part of it. So it's almost being deliberate in your thinking, and then allowing yourself, once you've kind of gotten into, okay, this is my chance to grieve, allowing yourself to naturally go to that place. So it's a combination of being deliberate and then naturally just letting it all go.
Yeah.
But I just think being cognizant of the full range of what you need to experience.
I completely agree. A lot of people have asked me, like, how do I do it? I think one of the biggest pieces I say is communication is really important for me too. So I communicate with my spouse and my partner what I can handle and what I can't. I do, my girls are young, but I do have real conversations with them about like what's happening, or, they still, like, my dad can still lift them up, although it looks like it strains him a little bit, but he still wants to do it. So I don't argue with him. But, and they're getting bigger, right? They're not toddlers anymore. But, it's just, they're different. And like, they have another set of grandparents that don't have the battle that my parents have. And so, explaining that as a young age, there's a wonderful book, I forget, and I don't know if I have it in my office right now, but there's a wonderful book that a young woman from Minnesota wrote. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's a kid's book for young people describing what happens with grandpa. So my kids have that. And so we start to have those conversations, but understanding that I can only do so much. And like, for the longest time, I was like, okay, well, my dad has this, I have to be an advocate for it. Like, I have to go out and I have to do all of these things and I have to change the world. And I'm like, oh, that can happen later. Like, I just need to enjoy my time with him. And yes, I'll still be a part of the community because it's been such a support system for me to know that I'm not alone. I know when I first experienced it, and I don't know about you, but I felt really alone. Mm-hmm. And then I started to examine things around me, and my faith is a really big part of my life. And it was very interesting because my two best friends had lost their dads, and I didn't even think about it, like, until I was in that space that one lost their dad to cancer, one lost their dad to ALS. So still very horrible diseases to watch loved ones go through, right? And my best friend from high school, her and I talked, and she was like, I don't know what's worse. Like, my dad got diagnosed when her dad, like the last months of her dad's life. She's like, I don't know what's worse. Like, your dad's death will be slow and painful, but he's physically healthy. Like, my dad is physically not healthy, but mentally there.
Right.
And it was an awesome experience to say, like, your pain isn't worse or bigger, than my pain. We just have different pain. And it created so much conversation and ability to be able to communicate what was happening and how that was. And so communicating not only what my needs were, but just being able to talk about what it was too, because it was an avenue I never thought I'd be down.
Yeah. No, and you don't expect it, not when you have little ones, and
Yeah.
you're gonna just, balance your life and start your business, and you appreciate that your book ended, but you just didn't expect that the bookends would be that heavy.
Yeah. And allowing myself spaces to cry and grieve and ever so often I have to remind my husband, like, you said it perfectly, like, we're constantly grieving. And so things that are small, like right now, dropping off groceries to our parents, right? Because we both are in the process of doing that. You still taking care of your mom. And it's like, I can't even hug him right now.
Yeah.
And I think, this disease, things can change so rapidly. When we come out of the other side of this and I can hug him again, is he going to remember me? So there are all these thoughts that spin through your head. How do you sort out those thoughts and create some, lasting structure around it too?
Right. And I think knowing that you're not alone is a huge part of it, and recognizing that others who are either going through it at the same time or who have been through it can kind of offer that additional perspective. That is helpful. But I think there's no question that right now it's so uncharted. And my heart just goes out to families like yours, but all of those families who have their loved ones in actually long-term care centers, so physically cannot connect at all. And to me, that's just utterly, like, impossible. It's unfathomable. And I do imagine I'd probably be one of those trying to break down the doors at the same time. What is best for your loved one? It's probably to stay in a place where they have their around the clock, skilled care that they require depending on their stage of the disease. And it's just so hard, though. I appreciate that the one solace of this journey is that you still can connect. You can still hold their hand. Well, now that is even being denied to families. And so that just breaks my heart too, just knowing that this is an especially difficult time. But this will pass. This too shall pass. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and those cards and calls and everything, and just, really connecting with the caregivers in the home too, that can make a big difference. That can bring you peace of mind and help them to know that you're checking in.
I think that's an important piece to talk about too, because our caregivers have been, we've had a journey with trying to find the right care and navigate a system. My professional life, I spend a lot of time helping people plan for these situations to happen. Unfortunately, I come from a family who did not plan at all, ever, from a financial standpoint. Not knocking my family at all. Just when you don't have it, there's nothing to plan with, like, at the end of the day. And so we've had to navigate a whole nother system to navigating Medicaid and having a support system or lack thereof. And you and I have spent a lot of time talking about how do we formulate a true support system for caregivers. Tell us a little bit more about your insight around that, because I'm excited to hear kind of some of the things that you're working on.
Yes. Well, and I did want to just backtrack to every family. You can feel like you've planned perfectly, and this disease can still throw you a curveball that is difficult to overcome. And I've literally done stories where I've interviewed Alzheimer's Association where they say, even multimillionaires can end up theoretically going bankrupt. And when you think about, the amount of care, I will be honest with you, it was $13,000 to $14,000 a month for my dad toward the end of his life. And though he did well at 3M, though he was very judicious with his money, no one can sustain that indefinitely. And so, with few exceptions. And so
I'm glad you said that, because a lot of people think that they can self-insure, and a lot of people think that they can overcome, the cost of what it might. And I'm not saying that, selling a long-term care policy is the way that you should solve in your personal situation. That's why you should have a plan. That's why you should be talking to people and figuring out what that could look like. But to your point, you can plan all you want, and you can have all of the ducks in a row, and still not have enough sometimes.
Absolutely. So it's just being aware of that and just being judicious throughout the journey, recognizing that the end part of the journey can be extremely expensive. And especially, and this is the time when I'll throw out one little stat. They say that, Alzheimer's will cost the country $1 trillion by 2050. So, it's projected to possibly bankrupt Medicare, which is part of why I am so outspoken, in addition to all the heartbreak and all the dismay that families like ours feel when we're on the journey. It's the fact that financially as a country, we simply can't afford it. I can't afford this disease. So it will bankrupt us emotionally and financially. And so I just think it's one of those things to be really cognizant of. But yeah.
And it doesn't discriminate.
No, it does not. And if anything, it's very multicultural. I think that the statistics for African Americans is slightly higher, and there are ongoing studies for why that is. But my family is as Swedish white as you can find in a Minnesota family to be. And so it racially is across the board, ethnically across the board. And so it's just one of those things that you need to be ready for and need to consider, particularly if you know that your family has, there's some predisposition for it. So, so the question about what I'm doing, I just feel so strongly and just affirming people that they are not alone, and recognizing that, through these darkest days, that there's a light, and that is really the commonality of these feelings, the fever and the fervor to fight it, and just the desire to do something about this horrible disease. And with that, I also feel like when I look back at my earliest days, and I kind of was sharing a lot about my dad in the beginning, and just kind of, it all comes so quickly. It's kind of like I download so quickly because it's all just a rush of information and feelings from those days. But also in the midst of all of that information and feeling was this literal sense of what's happening and what do I need to know? What is going on? And I feel like we have some amazing organizations and communities for Alzheimer's in our community, including the Alzheimer's Association, for which I'm so personally grateful. But I also would love to see more of that personal connection, and maybe just like a hand of an outreach, of a personal connection to say, okay, here is where we're going. And, not necessarily previewing all of what's to come, because some of the harder stages down the road, you just experience when you get there. You don't need to get a preview of that necessarily. But at the same time, a reminder to say, hey, be grateful for holding. Yes, he's not recognizing you, but just know that holding his hand does still mean something. You need to still appreciate that. And by the way, also be, looking into what hospice can provide you. So, somebody who can help you to know the timing a little bit better, to know the timeline. And so looking specifically at, what we can do better, and what I can do, what kind of role I can play to help provide that service, both in terms of, speaking to our community at large, but also on a more individual basis, and working with homes and centers to try to provide that insight as well. All kind of part of a vision that I have of just continuing to help the community that has meant so much to me through my journey, and that I will forever have a fondness for, because I've seen now that in the midst of this community are some really tireless and committed caregivers who deserve our support and need our love and our respect, frankly. And so I want to support them, but I also want to make sure our loved ones get the kind of dignity and respect they deserve at the end of this really awful disease.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I answered that fully.
Well, yeah, and I think, I mean, I can only speak to my own journey, right? And then the clients' journeys that I've had, but there isn't really. Yes, we have the Alzheimer's Association is wonderful, but like for my mom, there isn't, even her social worker is hard to navigate and have conversations with and get a response from because she's overworked. It's not her fault. It's not that she doesn't want to. I have to kind of remind my mom that of every once in a while, right? Like, because we get in a space where we're like living in our own world, and but like they're overworked. They can't give in the way they want to, and not everyone has access to a social worker either. You get awarded that at a certain stage of wherever you are, whether you're in a home or if you're using, services that are supported, but there isn't somebody to say like, at this stage, maybe you should start thinking about this, or this is what you can expect to see, right? My mom and I were searching the internet and resources to figure out like, what should we be doing in an early stage, right? We don't know. What should we be watching for? And then my mom's big question was like, okay, now we're at a later stage, that middle, we don't even like middle stage. His doctor, like all his doctor wanted to be like, is the prescription working?
Right.
So my mom's like, no, like, I have other questions that I would like. And it was just like, we can't answer those. So I think having resources where somebody has a person that they can go to through this phase is so important. What do you envision that looking like?
So I really truly believe it will be a model of a combination of services, truly, in terms of blanket information. My own writings that I've done over the course of my journey and my dad's journey, and putting that in one place to be able to reference, and coupled with, so a lot of it was more emotional in nature, but coupling my emotional reflections at those different stages with, okay, practically this is what you might want to be considering doing at this point. So having that kind of material available. Beyond that, I really, on a very product services basis, I really do want to connect with our centers throughout our communities, throughout the state, beyond, I don't know, to just really say, this is our experience. I have glimpsed caregivers who are very gifted, and it's not necessarily a reflection of education or years in the field. Sometimes there are some innate skills and understanding of how to interact with these people with this disease that just translates to success. Success for the caregiver, makes their lives easier in a very difficult job, and certainly success when it comes to your loved one and how the family feels about seeing your loved one cared for in a respectful, dignified way. It's a win-win, right? So going around to these centers and just kind of demonstrating to them, this is what works. This is, recognizing that if they're resisting, if they are showing, any sort of discomfort or irritation, and that comes off as aggression, the reason largely is because this is a very vulnerable moment for them. This is a very personal moment, and there's feelings that they don't even understand, but it comes down to basic feelings of violation and, that human dignity to try to preserve privacy and that sort of thing. And so just trying to, just build up an understanding, and with always the understanding too, the caregivers are among our hardest workers, and they're helping several people in a given day. So never to underestimate or to demean what they're doing, but just to shed more of a light and to try to explain further that other additional perspective. And on that point, I do have one caregiver in particular who was just especially gifted in working with my dad. And she was a gift to our family, and just a beautiful young woman who just got it, who just gets it. And to be able to give her a platform to share some of what she intuitively knew how to do, I think it is of a great service to everyone. And then, so just, doing that sort of outreach and that kind of, because I think you can't underestimate empathy, especially when the empathy is coupled with concrete information.
Mm-hmm.
So finding opportunities. So that's why I talk about going to the care centers. That's why I talk about material. Let's talk, I do a lot of emceeing just with my, work role. And now I'm doing more conferences and that sort of thing, but just continuing to bring out the message of, you're not alone. I'm here. This is this amazing man who I lost, but this is also what you need to know for you, for him, for you, for her, whoever it might be. And this is how you too can survive this really heartbreaking journey. And then throughout all of that too, that little advocacy angle, because I do have hope. I have hope that despite the fact that 4 out of 5 kids in my dad's family, ended up succumbing to this disease, despite the fact that, and it's just the reality of how I process everything. I mean, I kind of expect that, I'm such a daddy's girl and how I think and everything, that it might be my future, but here's where I want it to stop. I do not want my children. I do not want my daughter to have that in her future. And I'm okay if this is, but I will go down fighting because our future generation is not to mention our country, for the reasons that I mentioned before. We can't continue this. We can't sustain it. And I don't want our children to have to experience this too. So that's where my advocacy will continue. And I'll be fighting. So for those of us in the journey, the survival that we need, the self-preservation, the dignity that we deserve, but then also trying to fight for our future generations, that this won't have to be something that they have to keep fighting for.
Oh, that's just, I mean, I can't wait to support you in this journey, because what your vision is incredible, and it is needed. And I see it not only from a personal standpoint, but a professional standpoint. I have had the privilege of being able to walk hand in hand with a lot of people through this journey, because my professional life, I mean, I say this all the time, money touches every part of your life. But especially when you're going through that caregiving stage and end of life, when it's either, anticipated or not anticipated, right? I've had both sides where families are, screaming and yelling at each other in a conference room to like those sobbing uncontrollably, and how to manage that communication and that journey and bring it back to the center of the person who experienced that. I also have, I have this great relationship with my dad, and I also know that not everybody has great relationships with the person that they're going to have to be responsible for caregiving either. And so I believe so much, and I know you do too, in that preservation of how do you care for the caregiver, because we as women tend to be caregivers more frequently than our male counterparts. It's just innately in us. I say it's a gift that we've been given.
Gift or curse.
Gift or curse. I try to focus on the fact that it's a gift. It's not always easy, but that's how do we continue to preserve that for ourselves when, as women, we also don't have the ability to let go of the titles that we always have either.
Right.
So how did you manage to continue to find who Karla was throughout the journey that you had with your dad?
I think necessity sometimes dictates that, right? Because as mentioned before, I still had to report to work. I still had to be mama. That was never going to stop. And so part of it was that. But part of it is honestly recognizing that I did lose a little bit. And maybe that's part of me being really intentional too now to help others. I think I'm redefining myself a little bit. I think a lot of that journey, I was so involved and so entrenched and so connected to my dad that, there is a bit of, now that he's passed, which he did a little over a year ago, I think that it shook my foundation a little bit. And so my bottom line being that you need to be deliberate about it, because even you may not even realize the extent to which you are still giving more than you realize. And it's still such a fundamental part of who you are that you'll still be undergoing a lot of transformation afterwards. And I think that's all very natural, particularly if you did have the gift of a close relationship with your
Mhm.
husband. But I just think that is all the more reason to allow yourself those breaks to be your mom, to be the mom, and um, to be the reporter or whatever, and to still allow yourself those outlets, because that will help you when you kind of lose your footing later on, because you still will have given a lot, and so it will help you to be able to kind of regain your stride and persist, and it's about persisting through this really ugly stage, and it's important to be there. And I don't regret that I gave as much as I did, such that my foundation was shaken. I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. But it is very it's very overwhelming, and you have to really, and that's why, again, for me, it was necessity that required me to switch gears and sometimes get out of the Alzheimer's mode. But it also, I think, is something that if you don't have it by necessity, you really need to set aside that time to deliberately make sure that you're still focusing on other aspects of you.
Yeah, for me, I had to have a routine in place that allowed me to move from caregiver to coordinator. Because again, when everything happened, I was like, oh, I got to be at every doctor's appointment. I have to be in person at every doctor's appointment. And then I've got to run this really demanding career, because when my dad was diagnosed, I had just had Savannah, and she was a newborn baby. I had 2 under the age of 2. I had postpartum anxiety. I call it my shit storm, because that's what it was. But therapy was a really big player in how I started to process things. And I think that as a society, we're getting more comfortable talking about mental health. And but I have always been a huge advocate for it. I saw the change that it created for me in my early 20s, when I needed it very badly, and so I've continued that relationship, and it really has been what has allowed me the space to take care of myself, because I go twice a month. So I go every other week, and I continue to do it even while quarantine. We do a virtual session, because for me, having that space, and I think it's so important that we pre-schedule it. It's like the dentist office for me, right? Like, I know that I'm going to have it, and I might not need a session at that point in time to, cry in the fetal position. I might be celebrating something, right? But I have that space already carved out for me. Whereas getting to a point of like uncontrollable emotion or whatever hits me at that point in time, and then trying to scramble, I'm a big believer in being able to have the space already created. And I had some I'm the only child, so I had some boundaries I had to set with my mom. Like, I literally cannot do all of this. So here's where we can seek help. We're going to use this care organization. One of my dear friends from high school, also, and like grade school, who is one of my dad's favorite people in life. Her family owns a like support caregiving mobile, whatever you call it. I'm blanking on what you would actually call it, but they come to your house and help care for the people, in-home care.
Yeah.
In-home care. So they own that. So she's been a great resource. So I was like, I can delegate this, right? I can take this piece off of my plate so I don't have to worry about it. I can communicate with her when we need help. My mom can communicate with her when we need help, but I don't have to be the one that has to be there all of the time. I've gotten to the point where doctor's appointments, if I can't physically be there, I'll call in, because there are some things that don't get translated correctly to me. So I need to hear it directly from the doctor. So, but just making sure that I have that ability to still be involved, but know that I don't literally have to do everything. So that was, as women, sometimes we feel like we have to put on the cape and rescue everybody.
And I have to applaud you for being so deliberate and conscious about that, because I think that as an only child, it would have been easy to slip into this mindset of I have to do everything, and you just simply can't. You can't make that happen. It just is overwhelming. And I had the advantage of having two sisters, one of whom is a lawyer, and she's out of state, so she can't be present very much. And so what she took on, which was just awesome, was really truly all the financial aspects of it.
Mhm.
So she was able to oversee my parents' finances, because my dad was, it was a fairly traditional assignment of duties, and my dad really had been overseeing a lot of that. And so she could plan her care and make sure, the kind of care that he was requiring, that they had the, money in the right accounts to make it all work. And just being able to delegate and also be able to divide those duties if you have siblings. But if you don't have siblings like you did, then you automatically have to contract out, right? You have to be able to take some of that off your plate, because it's just simply too much. So truly, in this situation, it allowed me to go to my dad's doctor's appointment and to be more that hands-on person, and to be more present in that way. And then my other sister kind of filled gaps wherever she could. So it just, having that divide and conquer approach when the task is so overwhelming is really critical. And again, if you're an only child, or maybe one of you is out of state and doesn't have the ability to be as present, then it's really imperative, I think, to look beyond the family unit and to say, okay, who do we need to help us navigate this, or handle this, or treat our dad with respect, or however it needs to happen, depending on the job.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, I'll be very like vulnerable and honest here. My parents were separated for 14 years of life, at a very critical stage in my life. And so and they're very, I love you, Mom, because you're watching this, I know, but very codependent individuals, and can sometimes be, I'm so proud of my mom because she's done so much work around this, and really sought a lot of help, and has a blunt daughter that gives a lot of feedback all the time. So she's done a great job with this, but I had to set boundaries for myself, because otherwise I was going to step into a lot of pain for me that I had to overcome for a long time. And that's why I say therapy was so good for me. I have had the same therapist since I was 21 years old. And so she knows every crevice, every dark, deep rooted secret. At some point I'm probably going to have to like have her on a, I'm your only client. No. But like I knew what I had to establish, and that was for my own benefit. Otherwise I was going to crumble. And the thing that I always have gone back to is my dad would never want me to be in that state. There are a lot of moving parts and things in our family that have never always made sense to everybody else. But I knew that my dad would never want me to sacrifice one of the girls, events to do something for him, or, building my dream career, which I've done all while taking care of my dad. It also allows me flexibility to be doing the things that I want to do. But he always wanted to make a mark in this world, and I think that he will, with the legacy that he leaves. And he always used to say this to me, and he said this a couple of times meeting with social workers, is he wants to leave a legacy. And so what I've said to him now is, I am your legacy.
Yeah.
I will be your legacy. So being able to understand like that forethought just isn't the space of creating a financial planning firm. It's really changing an industry, just like you're talking about, creating a space that allows people to have those relationships that come so critically at stages in our lives where we need a team the most and a
Yeah.
support system the most. And my dad's journey has just allowed me the space to be able to see that in a more personal manner and have that empathy for the person that's on the other side of the table, whether it's Alzheimer's or some other horrible disease that they have to walk with their loved ones through. I can now, at a younger age, not that I wanted to experience this, but I can use it as a vessel in a vehicle. And so that's why I feel like we were given this, not that it's something you want to accept, because you don't.
Yeah, no question. But it's that empathy, right? I still will reflect on first time I had my heart broken, and how, sad and difficult it was. But, it's happened in everyone's lives, multiple times in your life. And from that point on, it helps you to understand better when people are experiencing, heartbreak. And similarly, this is, and I would argue, a totally different scale, the kind of life and death battles and losing someone, particularly in what I would describe a really cruel way. It gives you this empathy that you can, it's almost empowering, that empathy, because it suddenly you have like this seventh sense, this eighth sense, and ninth sense all built into you, because you had no idea what, this huge swath of people in our society were experiencing. Now, sadly, we know, but it does allow us to connect and relate to them in a way that can only help everyone, because it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It allows us to say to each other, you are not alone. Mm-hmm. I understand. I've gone through this too. I'm going through this too. This is how I knew to survive it. This is how I can help you. That sort of thing really makes all the difference for people who sadly will experience this also.
Yes. Oh, you and I could literally sit and talk about this topic probably for days, not even just hours.
I know. I feel the same way. And I also feel like, there's no question. And I that's why I want to do more with it, because I do think that there's such a desire for people on the journey to just hear each other and listen to each other, and also just take in the information and the emotion and that like utter support. I am not, it sounds cliche or cheesy when I say it when I MC my events, but I refer sometimes to my Alzheimer's family, and I feel that support when I put it out into the universe, whether it's in social media posts or when I did a story recently, or even when I'm sharing now. I always feel that connection with people who know exactly what I'm talking about. I receive so much more than I give, because it is so critical.
And we learn from each other's journeys. I've learned from your journey. Obviously you're a few steps ahead of me. Not that that's a race that you want to be on.
Right. Or that you want to win.
Yeah, nobody wants to win that race. But I'm able to see that, and I'm able, when I do share vulnerable moments with my dad, 3-hour doctor's appointments and, trying times of, trying to get a almost 70-year-old man to think sweatpants are cool again. And understanding that like that's a process for me. I never thought at 35 I'd be convincing my dad that sweatpants were cool again. I had to wear my leisure pants. I'm like, no, Dad, literally they are cool again. I wear pants that have elastic on them every day. But I mean, and finding some sense of humor in all of it, right? As much as we can, so that we are not alone throughout this entire process. Where can people follow along for this journey so that they can find some more resources when you launch?
So all of this is, part of why I've been somewhat vague with my explicit, because it's all still in development. And so I'm just, really wanting to be very careful with my descriptions. I am not, the journalist in me doesn't want to overpromise or wants complete and utter transparency and accuracy. No fake news here. So so at the time, or right now, it would be just simply my social media account. So it's just Karla Hult on Instagram, Karla Hult on Twitter, and Karla Hult on Facebook. So that's really where I'm using doing most of my outreach right now. And I'll post a lot about the events that I'm seeing and that sort of thing. And then from there, a lot is under design and being work done as we speak, maybe not right as we speak, probably after we speak. And then, so that will be launched. There'll be, announcements on those social media channels.
And I will just say, if you are a caregiver, or you aren't, I will say to those people that you aren't, chances are you will be at some point. And so pay attention to what Karla's doing. She is going to literally change how this world looks at this disease, give it grace, give it dignity. You are going to do this, and I believe in you so much. And so please make sure that you follow this journey with her too. And that's not pressure for you. It's just belief in you and what you're doing. I think that you're doing a phenomenal job. So we will be here to support you every step of the way. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate that. And success or failure, it's all done with 100% sincerity. So that is, and with my best wishes for everyone who is on this journey. There for you. You are not alone.
Absolutely.